Welcome, everyone. We are so glad to have you here at our Crossroads luncheon, which is not a luncheon, but we are online. And so, really glad to have everyone with us. And we're going to talk about extremism in Iowa and national trend across the country. And just wondering if a lot of the things that we see in Iowa in legislation and in actions are happening in other parts of the country and where that's happening, what those trends are. I am delighted to have my good friend who we became friends over a lot of different legislation in the last probably, I don't know, 8 years or so, Nick. And Nik Nartowicz, who is the lead policy counsel at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And Nik joined Americans United in 2017 as lead policy counsel. Nik tracks and analyzes legislation that would affect church-state separation and religious liberty. He serves as an expert on church-state separation law and policy to state and federal legislators and staff, advocates, media, and public. And he certainly has been a huge help to me and to Interfaith Alliance of Iowa through the years. Nik joined Americans United after working in Washington, D.C. for Mayor Muriel Bowser in the Office of Federal and Regional Affairs. And as policy counsel, he worked with Congress and federal agencies to advance D.C.'s priorities in judiciary, legal, public safety, LGBTQ technology issues. And so he has a wide range of knowledge and experience, and I'm just very delighted to have you with us today, Nik.
Very happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I tell the story all the time about how Connie is one of my favorite people to work with in the States. I am based here in Washington, D.C., and so I rely a lot on people who are doing the work on the ground in the States to pass on information, to know what's happening better than I can. And I remember my first year, the first bill that I had come up in Iowa, my coworker said, "Oh, there's someone at Interfaith Iowa. We have her name somewhere. Track her down, and she will help you out." And she's been an amazing partner ever since. So I'm very glad to be here and to be speaking to you all today. So hopefully this is interesting. If not, I can't promise I will be uplifting, but I will try to at least hopefully be educational, and we will go from there.
Yeah,
So, oh,
I'm gonna go off screen and just turn it over to you, Nik.
great. So what I want to start with is private school vouchers, actually, which I know hopefully everyone here has heard of, at least because that is a phenomenon not only in Iowa, but also across the country. Because Americans United was actually founded to fight private school vouchers. We were founded in 1947 to oppose private school vouchers, and it's still a lot of the work that we do today. And the majority of the work that we do against vouchers is done at the legislative level, because particularly over the last 3 to 5 years, the Supreme Court has gutted our ability to file lawsuits that challenge voucher programs, whether under specifically under state constitutions, which unsurprisingly coincides with a proliferation of these programs, and particularly universal voucher programs. So vouchers come in a lot of different forms. The common one that we see now are what we call education savings accounts. And so that's where the government takes money, puts it in an account. Oftentimes it's a credit card or a debit card like system that allows parents to spend that money on whatever they want, primarily tuition at religious schools, which is why Americans United comes to this work. But what we see, especially in the last couple of years, as these programs have grown so much, is that vouchers don't actually improve student achievement. They primarily fund people who are already attending private school, especially again in the universal voucher context, where there are no limits on who can get access to a voucher. They raise tuition. This has been documented a lot in the state of Iowa, where schools, now that the voucher is there, just upped their tuition by the amount of the voucher and said, okay, great, still pay us the same amount of money, or you still pay the same amount of money, but we get an extra $7,000 per student from the state. And they fund discrimination. They hurt rural schools. Again, a big problem in the state of Iowa because they draw money away from public schools, which in rural communities are often the lifeblood of that community. They'll be the biggest employer where people go on the weekends for football games, etc. They fund discrimination against students with disabilities. And the list of reasons to oppose vouchers is pretty much endless. But we have seen a real proliferation of these, and Iowa was a big fight 3 years ago. Was it 3 years ago? My time is difficult since the pandemic. 2 to 3 years ago, I forget exactly what the timeline was. But after Governor Reynolds actually fought against people who had opposed vouchers, helped primary them and oppose their reelection, and then they replaced those people, and within the first month of the new session, they had passed a voucher bill. And that is something we are seeing across the country, right? And actually, this week alone, Texas is in the same place that Iowa is, where there had been a long fight against vouchers for many years in a row. And this week, the Texas House passed vouchers for the first time ever. And it looks like that bill is going to get passed. So we're seeing a lot of states that had stood up for a long time, those dominoes fall. I will say on the voucher front, this is, the small bright spots where I can. All is not lost. There were actually three ballot initiative issues on vouchers last year, one in Colorado, one in Nebraska, and one in Kentucky, and all of them went in favor of being opposed to vouchers. So the Kentucky voucher initiative was actually to amend their state constitution. The Kentucky legislature passed a bill 3 years ago. That was then they filed a lawsuit on it, and the Kentucky Supreme Court struck it down, saying it violated the state constitution. So the pro-voucher people wanted to amend the constitution, and they failed. Not only did they failed overwhelmingly. It was, I think, 69% of voters voted against vouchers. In every single county, the ballot initiative lost. In deep ruby red Kentucky, voters said no to vouchers and yes to public schools. And in Nebraska, it was actually the legislature had passed a voucher bill for the second year in a row, and pro-public school groups there got the issue on the ballot again for the second year in a row. The second year was because after it made the ballot the first time, the legislators went back and repealed the bill, only to pass a new one to force the pro-public school groups to start all over again. But despite that, they raised the money, they got the signatures, they got it on the ballot, and voters again overwhelmingly rejected the idea of a voucher bill in that school. They overturned the voucher through the ballot. So when this question is put to voters, they reject it. They have rejected it every time it's been on the ballot in the last 50 plus years. So voters still oppose vouchers, even if legislators don't. So we can keep working on that. We know all is not lost on the voucher front, even as they are having a lot of legislative wins because there's just so much money on the pro-voucher side. It's also happening in Congress. You might have heard of the Educational Choice for Children Act, or ECHA, as we call it, because everything gets a nice acronym here in DC. So ECHA would actually create basically a nationwide voucher program. It would create a federal voucher program where donors could donate money to what are called scholarship granting organizations, who then give that money to fund vouchers. We call them SGOs. And so it's a tuition tax credit scheme, right? So say that I am, I don't know, I'm going to say Betsy DeVos, and I am a billionaire. I can give $100 million to a scholarship granting organization or multiple scholarship granting organizations in states across the country, and they'll then fund vouchers. The problem is that I, as Betsy DeVos, when I have my army of tax attorneys file my taxes, I can get a dollar for dollar tax credit back on my donation. So it's not actually a donation. It is the government just paying for vouchers through me as the taxpayer. So that's how that system would work. And again, it would impose it on essentially every state in the country. So even states that have rejected vouchers, have never considered them, there would be a spot there where a scholarship granting organization could start up in that state and students would have access to that money. It would also be in addition to all of the money that's already spent on vouchers now in the states that do have those programs. And that program, that one estimate is actually that will cost $134 billion over 10 years. When you factor in the cost of the voucher, there's also like an escalator clause and lost capital gains taxes, et cetera. That is a lot of money, even to the federal government, which throws around large amounts of money. $134 billion over 10 years is a lot of money to send to private schools, including private religious schools. Right now, we expect that to be part of the reconciliation package in Congress. If people have questions about that, we can get there. I won't get into the intricacies of congressional procedure. But the short version is that this bill is essentially impossible to actually pass on its own as a standalone bill in Congress because there's enough opposition to vouchers. So they want to sneak it into essentially a must-pass bill that only requires a 50% vote in the House and the Senate. So this would be kind of a new landscape in the voucher front to actually impose it on the entire country, not just on the states that have done it. And again, these numbers would be just astronomical and increase the amount of money that's spent on vouchers, I think 4 or 5 times more than what's spent right now per year. So the next topic I want to move to, which I think is one people tend to associate with Americans United and probably a little bit with, or a lot with Interfaith Alliance, is religion in public schools. There are a lot of bills flying around right now in a number of states, the first of which I'm going to talk about are chaplain bills. So these types of bills would allow public schools to hire or have chaplains as volunteers in this public school. Sometimes they actually allow them to serve as school counselors. Sometimes it's just to offer additional services and programs to students. But the idea is that we have chaplains who are, of course, religious faith leaders in public schools serving students. If they're meant to replace counselors, we know that chaplains are not actually trained nearly in the same way that school counselors are. They have very different skill sets. And indeed, chaplains themselves recognize this. There's a letter from more than 300 chaplains from across the country opposed to this idea that says that chaplains are not trained to replace or do the work of school counselors, nor is their job to work in public schools. Chaplains have a very specific skill set, and they are not trained to work in public schools and solve the problems that public school children have. But these bills we're tracking, right now we're tracking, I think it's about 25 bills in 18 states. And this came out of Texas in 2023. It was the first time I or any of my colleagues had seen a bill like this. Texas did pass it, and then last year Florida and Louisiana did as well. And the common theme that I will be talking about a lot today is the idea that when one state tries something, often in our world a bad idea, the next year a few states mimic it, and then the year after that a lot of states mimic it. So again, 2023 is the first time we saw this. Last year we tracked these bills in about 6 or 7 states. Actually, Iowa was one of them, but it didn't really move. And this year these bills are moving in a lot more states. So far, none have actually passed this year, which is great news, but we are far from the end of legislative sessions, so there is still plenty of time, unfortunately, for a chaplain bill to pass in Iowa or in, actually, I meant to check the status of, did they both die or did they all die in Iowa? Okay, no, they did not die yet. So at least one bill is potentially still alive in Iowa, and in a number of other states as well. Relatedly, bills to put the Ten Commandments in public schools are extremely popular this year. This was another bill from 2023 in Texas. You will note a lot of things start in Texas. And the idea there is that it requires every public school to post the Ten Commandments. Again, across the country, the types of bills vary, but the most common one we see requires that they be posted in every single classroom in the state. Which I don't care if you are Maine or Wyoming or you are Texas or California, that is a lot of classrooms. And that is a lot of children seeing the Ten Commandments every single day. And the argument is that they're not posting the Ten Commandments as a religious code, they're just posting them because they're foundational to American society and the American legal system, and that they're historical. Except, again, they're in every single classroom. So why do the Ten Commandments, if they're historical, need to be in music class or Spanish class or math class? Because we know the idea is not actually to post the Ten Commandments because they're historical, but to force kids to read the Ten Commandments every single day in every single class they attend, from kindergarten all the way up through high school. In fact, there is a Supreme Court case that says that it is unconstitutional to post the Ten Commandments in public schools because it serves no educational purpose. The only reason to post them on the walls in a public school is to make kids read them with the idea that they will follow them. The law allows public schools to talk about Ten Commandments if you were to have a class on ethics or world history or whatever it is, when there's an educational purpose to it. So if you're talking about what are legal codes throughout history, you can talk about the Ten Commandments alongside Hammurabi's Code, alongside the US Constitution, alongside the Magna Carta, etc. If you want to talk about it in terms of a world religions class and see what moral rules guide different religions and compare them, that is a reasonable way to do it. What you cannot do is just put it on the walls of a school to force kids to read it, and again, to try to force them to obey it. These we're seeing even more of. There are 32 to 35 bills. Actually, I feel like we just added a couple to our tracker, but last time I counted it was 32 across 20 different states this year. Texas actually failed to pass their bill in 2023 when they did. Louisiana succeeded the year after, so they passed one last year. Americans United is suing that, or has filed a lawsuit against that alongside the ACLU of Louisiana, and the Freedom from Religion Foundation. We've actually had good luck at the trial court. We won, and we're told that this schools where we sued had to not put up the Ten Commandments. That case is, of course, on appeal, and we expect will eventually make its way to the Supreme Court. But we are waiting right now for an appellate decision on that case, which could kind of dictate what happens in the rest of these states. We're in a similar spot with the chaplains bills, despite the fact that it is in 20 states. Only one state so far has actually passed a bill through both chambers. Arkansas did, or actually, I'm sorry, it was actually just signed on Monday by the Arkansas governor. So Arkansas is the only state this year so far to pass the Ten Commandments bill. But again, there are still bills alive in a number of states. And this is a really troubling trend we're seeing, that the reason that they're doing this is because they want to test longstanding Supreme Court precedent. So that decision I mentioned was from 1980. It's called Stone v. Graham. They want to challenge that decision. They want it to get to the Supreme Court with the hope that they will overturn it and allow them to use the public schools to promote religion far more than they ever have before, which, there are still schools right now that, despite the Supreme Court, have the Ten Commandments up in public schools or allow students to pray or do things, right? We get complaints about that all the time. But this would change it, and instead of people being able to complain to us and allow us to send a letter and threaten to sue, it would essentially sanction this, and you would see schools throughout the country start posting the Ten Commandments and using public schools to promote religion, and, to be totally honest, primarily promote Christianity, right? They're not promoting different religions, they are promoting Christianity. Two other types of religion schools bills that we see pretty often are prayer in schools bills. So these are kind of any type of bill that would promote either student prayer or teacher prayer. Both teachers and students have the right to pray in public schools right now under Supreme Court precedent. Students have the right to engage in prayer during free periods. If they're at lunch, they can read the Bible when they're allowed to read texts. If you just have free reading time, you can read the Bible. You can talk about religion with other students. You just can't coerce students to participate. Teachers have kind of similar rights, right? So they are allowed to practice their religion, engage in religious practices, read the Bible, pray, etc., so long as it's not coercive of students and not during student time. So, you're on your free period and you're a teacher, you can pray, you can read your Bible, you can talk with other teachers about religion, etc. What these bills seek to do is either blur that line or actually push it further than what the Constitution says right now. Again, there is a host of Supreme Court precedent that sets out the rules around prayer in public schools. You may have heard of a case from 2022 called Kennedy v. Bremerton. If you don't know that name, you probably heard of the praying coach case out of Washington State. That is that case. To quickly summarize that case, what happened there was Coach Kennedy was a football coach who was praying with and in front of not only his players, but also players from other schools. When the school he worked for found out, they told him he had to stop. He stopped engaging in some of the prayers, but then turned around and said, I'm actually going to keep praying, and I want to say prayers at the 50-yard line after game in front of students. And there was essentially a big spectacle. He announced it via his lawyers to the school district. A congressman actually showed up. A bunch of press showed up when he was doing this. People ended up rushing the field, knocking down students and hurting them. And after all that happened, the school said, okay, we're paying you unpaid administrative leave. At the end of the season, he had to reapply for his job, which he did not do. And so he was not rehired. He then turned around and sued the school district, saying that his rights had been violated. In the decision that ended up coming down, the Supreme Court said that he had been fired only for 3 specific instances when he prayed silently by himself instead of they kind of ignored the actual full facts of the case. So on the one hand, the decision could have gone much further, right? It could have said he was allowed to pray in front of students all the time. It did not do that, which is a good thing. But it willfully misstated the actual facts of the case to make it harder for schools to control when teachers pray in front of students and to, again, kind of push the envelope on what coercion means. So the case did reaffirm the idea that teachers cannot pray in front of or with students. They can't coerce students to participate. But it just makes the line a little bit harder for teachers and school administrators to understand and to protect their students from being coerced to participate in religion. All of these bills, the Ten Commandment bills, the chaplain bills, the prayer in schools bills, legislators will repeatedly say this bill is allowed because of that Kennedy case. They're not. Nothing in those cases say that any of these bills are allowed. And in fact, they are explicitly not allowed under what they said in Kennedy. But the Kennedy decision also overturned an older Supreme Court precedent, which again, I can talk about if people have questions, but I won't get into the details. And so what the legislators are saying is, oh, any case that relied on that precedent is now no longer good law. That's not how the law works. They don't care though. They just want to pass the laws that they want to pass. And again, set up more challenges down the line to extend the idea behind these Supreme Court cases. And the last bill in this area that I'll talk about are release time bills or release time education bills. You might have seen these in the news as well. They've been making a lot of news, particularly in Ohio and Indiana. Release time programs let students leave public school campus to go get religious instruction during the school day. There is a case out of the 1950s that says that these programs are constitutional, but there are specific limits on what happens. The school can't promote it. They can't leave students that stay in school behind. They are not allowed to spend a lot of funds to make it happen. Students have to leave campus. What we're seeing now is a big trend of laws to require that every school or school district in the state have a policy allowing release time programs. Under the Supreme Court case, schools can have programs or districts can have programs, and a lot of states have laws that say schools can adopt a program, but the bills that we're seeing now are making them mandatory. Some are actually making them not only mandatory, but allowing students to get credit for this release time when they get that religious education. And that is where it really gets problematic, because if you are a minority student or a student of minority religion who lives in a community with one particular faith, so you're a Jewish student and you live in a city where people are mostly Christian, so all of your friends leave to go to this program. A lot of those kids can get left behind in the school and just sent to a study hall, or have there's evidence of teachers who have tried to get kids to go to the program so that they can have an extra free period. They get peer pressured into joining, they feel left out, etc., right? And so when you have these mandatory programs, it encourages more kids to take part, which only exacerbates the problems that we see with release time education programs as it is. So the next thing I'll talk briefly about are religious refusals. So those are any situation where it allows someone to refuse either a service or providing healthcare on the basis of the provider's religious beliefs. A great example of this is around abortion care, right? So a lot of times people refuse to provide abortion care because of their religious beliefs. There's a rash of bills that have been introduced in the last couple of years to allow medical providers to opt out of any medical procedure that violates their beliefs, which on its face sounds reasonable, and any individual faith care provider has the right to say, I don't agree with this and I won't provide this service. But we need to make sure that people are still getting the care that they need. So oftentimes, right, we want to make sure that they can get a referral to another doctor who will provide the service or another hospital. And the other problem that we see in these bills is they don't just say doctors, they will say medical practitioners and medical institutions. And both of those are defined very broadly. So it's not just a doctor saying, oh, I don't want to perform this particular healthcare service, because it's not just about abortion. There's also gender affirming care. There's lots of types of care that can be refused. But you could be working at a rural health clinic, and I could be a secretary there and say, I'm not going to schedule any patients who want to come in to even ask about birth control because I don't believe in abortion. So you might be a patient who has endometriosis and needs birth control or needs some other sort of care, and the secretary at the clinic refuses to even schedule you. If I'm the only employee that does the scheduling, then that entire clinic wouldn't be able to provide that service. Or if I do billing and I refuse to bill for anything that looks like gender affirming care, right? Everyone in that community might not be able to get the care that they need. And these bills often explicitly set the standards so that doctors don't have, or any provider doesn't have to refer you to someone else who can get the care. So people who have limited insurance options, or again, live in rural communities far away from other providers, are going to not only have a harder time finding care, they'll probably be left without that care altogether, which can be life-threatening. We also see religious refusals in the context of people being able to refuse to use the correct pronouns for people based on their religious beliefs, as well as being able to provide services to LGBTQ people. So if you're a wedding vendor and you don't want to provide services, you write you're a calligrapher and you write invitations and you want to refuse to work with people, we see bills about that as well. And then the last big thing I'm going to touch on, because this is actually in the news, or not in the news, is new for us that we're looking at this week, was a presidential memo from last week where the president signed a memo to say that every agency in the country should look at all of their regulations, which is the overwhelming majority of laws that people have to follow are come out of agency regulations. That they should look at every regulation and make sure they comport with 10 Supreme Court cases. Two of those are Supreme Court cases that we have been very heavily involved in. One is Carson v. Macon, which is primarily about whether or not states have to fund religious schools when they fund private education. And the other actually came out of the pandemic. There was a case called Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn v. Cuomo, where the Supreme Court struck down pandemic restrictions by New York State because they said they unfairly targeted religious organizations. And so what that means is that the way that the White House has interpreted those cases is that religion and religious organizations have to be given at least equal treatment to secular options. So that could end up causing kind of a cascade of elimination of or changes to regulations that are designed to protect people. Because right now, a lot of federal regulations allow, say, religious organizations to provide federal services. So if I'm a religious organization and I want to get into providing services for people who are homeless, I can apply for federal grants, I can receive that money. There are often restrictions on that grant. So even if I'm religious, because it's a federal grant, I have to serve everyone. I can't just serve people who are my religion. I can't make people who come to my services attend religious services to get that care, right? I'm getting a federal grant. I have to serve everyone in my community, regardless of their religion, regardless of their religious beliefs, regardless of my religious beliefs. This kind of analysis of all these regulations could strike down those protections, which will make it harder for people to get federally funded services because they're being provided by religious organizations. And like I said, this only happened last week. We are still kind of thinking through the broader implications of this and what a response looks like, but that is something that is kind of on the forefront for us. So I wanted to highlight. So I will stop talking there and turn it back over to Connie.
And take a drink of water because that was a lot. Thank you so much, Nick. That was an amazing overview of what's happening across our country. For those of you who are live with us, we're going to use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen for questions. I should have said that earlier. But down at the bottom, usually people are used to using the chat, but we're going to use the Q&A. So if you just tap on that and put your question in the Q&A, then we'll go through some of those questions. But I think it's interesting while we're waiting for those to pop up. We do have in Iowa everything that you talked about. All of the issues that you described, we have seen or are seeing in the legislature, including the religious refusal bill. That is still active, and two bills that are active in the Senate that would, they call them conscience clauses, of course, so we have all of those that are happening in our state. I guess I don't know that we have an active prayer in school, but we certainly have had one, and especially after the Kennedy decision. So definitely have been seeing all of those pieces. Do you think, Nick, that this is just going to continue to explode? I mean, we've just had an explosion of you've listed a couple of state or a couple of issues, the number of pieces of legislation that you're seeing across the country. Is this just going to continue to grow? And then related to that, how do we more effectively address them?
Yeah, those are great questions. I think, yes, they will continue to grow, right? We see this trend repeatedly, but we also see two things. One, that there's kind of an upper limit of what will actually happen. So when I started at AU, we saw an influx of bills to post In God We Trust in public schools. That often was like every school building or sometimes every classroom as well. And they ended up passing in about 30 something states and then kind of stopped because there were no more states. There now we see a couple of those bills every year, but there aren't really any more states who are going to do that, right? It's these things tend to happen in a cluster of states, and they'll be introduced in a lot of states, whether they be blue or red states, but they won't move in some states, right? And so there's just some states that will never get to it, and it will kind of die down as a popularity. I also think we see big cyclical changes in the way society works, right? Like in the 60s, there were a number of Supreme Court decisions that came down that limited the way that religion could happen in public schools. And there was a big backlash to that. There were efforts to amend the federal constitution to allow that. There were efforts in state legislatures to have prayer in schools and those types of things. And those eventually died down, right, as people move on and move on to other things. So it will keep growing for now, but it will eventually slow down and then stop and then turn over and not become an issue. There was, I don't remember what the issue was, but there was something that I had not seen before that popped up. Or it was like the parents' rights bills. We don't actually do a ton of work on those, but I was looking into them, and someone suggested we have a magazine at AU, when the person who writes the magazine has been working at AU for since 1990. So they said, go to Rob and see what he knows. And he was like, oh yeah, I wrote this article from like 1997 about these bills, right? And it was all of the same talking points about why parents' rights bills were so important were the same ones that they used at the time. And I was like, I was in middle school, like up to high school at that time, and like I don't remember any of this happening, but it was literally the same arguments being used then about why we need them, and our kids are, if we don't have these bills, our kids are going to be doomed. And they didn't pass and nothing happened. The kids were fine. And here we are back again with that same rash of parental rights bills and the same dire talking points. So everything old is new again, and everything new will eventually become old.
It's kind of like fashion. It just comes back again, whether it's good or not. So yeah,
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly. The same way that 90s jeans are back, so are 90s legislation, I guess. That's
And so your thoughts on how do we stop some of this, and how do
right.
we be more effective?
Yeah. So that is always the problem, right? I think the answer that I used to give is a little bit answer from the answer I give now. I think it's still important to reach out to your legislators, right? Like to your state legislators, to your federal legislators. It's important that you hear from them. I warned at the beginning I wouldn't be a ray of sunshine. I don't think legislators listen nearly as much as they used to. I have worked on Capitol Hill. I've never worked for a legislator. And, did the legislators I worked for listen to every constituent? No. But did we collect the information about what our constituents thought about big issues? And did that sometimes sway my boss's opinion? Absolutely, right? Like they might have had a particular take on a bill, and when their constituents said, 60% of us actually view it differently than you, it changed the vote. I don't think that happens as much now. I think the vouchers are a great example of that, even despite the way the votes go, despite the polling on this. There's so much outside influence and outside money that is guiding things more than not. But if they don't hear from you, they'll think that what they're doing is right. If they do hear from you and know what they're doing is wrong and not what people want, it'll cause some people some hesitation. It will slow some people down. It might get them to say, "Hey, actually, I don't want to take this hard vote. Can we pull this off the calendar or not vote on it because I don't want my constituents to give me blowback and I can't vote against it because you won't let me vote against it." So I think that's really powerful. But I think the most important thing is people just don't know about this. Everyone is busy all the time. You have your jobs, and I'm so grateful that all of you can show up to this, especially in the middle of the day. But think about all the people you know who have no idea about any of these issues because they can't show up to this because whether they're working or they have kids or whatever the answer is, right? We all have a million things we're worried about all the time. So talking to your friends and family and making them understand it, even I will go home and my mom will say, I saw something in the news or whatever, right? She kind of has a vague idea of it. And I spend a lot of time talking to my family to just explain the issues because I'm fortunate in that I get to work in this and know it really well, but the average person doesn't. And so even just telling them that these problems exist, to me, chaplain bills and 10 Commandment bills are top of mind. A lot of people probably don't even know that these are out there, don't know that they're making their way through the state legislature. They don't think about their state legislature. So, I kind of entreat every person that I speak to, find 5 people in your life to talk to and ask them to talk to 5 other people about these issues. People who you think will agree with you, who will understand why this is a problem, why we need to stop it. and get them to talk to people as well and just spread that word so that people know what's happening, because that will lead to things like more people talking to their legislators, getting the word out. It will, it will get more coverage in the newspaper. It will get more coverage on the nightly news, whatever it is, and really expose what a problem these bills are.
Thank you. We do have some questions in the Q&A tab. The first one is, how would private colleges or seminaries respond to federal pressure to drop student loan option if they don't drop DEI?
Starting off really easy. Yeah, that is a great question. And I think, my personal instinct is very different than my lawyer instincts. Um, this is the thing that right now my alma mater is dealing with, and I have thoughts on how they're dealing with it. I think schools need to balance their ability to make sure that their kids don't lose out on educational opportunities with how much they can push back. I am fortunate to have gone to a college that has a very large endowment, and I'm more frustrated that they're not standing up and saying, "We have a more than $1 billion endowment. Do what you want to us. We will protect our kids until this goes away." Not every school is in that position, so I don't think it's the same thing. But I want every school to stand up as much as they can, such that it's not going to hurt their students' access to education, right? And obviously, getting rid of DEI policies automatically undermines their students' access to education in general, right? But there's a lot of factors to consider, and I don't think there's an easy answer. But the ones that can and have the money and the power to do it should, and the ones that can't should figure out, what can we do to minimize the harms in any way that we can.
Yeah. Another question is the genesis of all of these bills stemming from authentic religion, do you think? Or are they part of the populist authoritarian agenda? And then the person says, I'm aware that Hillsdale has been closely advising Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, another good question. So I will say personally, I'm not a person of faith. And one of the things I love about this job is getting to work with so many faith communities who care about these issues. Because before I came here, even someone who was as steeped as policy and politics as I was, in my brain, it was always religious freedom meant kind of Christians versus, and that's not remotely the case, which I love. But through this work, I've gotten to know a lot of people who are Christians, various denominations, non-Christian denominations, etc. And someone once said to me, like they really don't like when it's called out of like real Christians versus fake Christians, because part of religion is that like you get to define it for yourself or your faith community, but you can't define it for other people. So the people who are doing this, whether or not you might call them, or I might call them, or other Christians might call them real Christians or not real Christians, right? They're kind of back and forth saying to each other, "Oh, you're not a real Christian. Well, you're not a real Christian, right?" And no one, unfortunately, is can be sure that they're absolutely correct. Because, and in this case, I don't think they don't just mean like who will one day get to heaven and find that their God is correct, but like they mean it in a more, I think, worldly sense. Um, so it's kind of impossible to know that. And I think no matter what, the people who do it have conviction that what they're doing is right and that what they're doing is based in authentic religion. So whether or not everyone finds it to be authentic, I don't think is really the answer. I think they often ally themselves with people who are not, right? Like the coalition that exists on the voucher front, for example, right? There are people who absolutely are again, mostly Christian, but of all religious denominations, but primarily Christian, who think like public education is bad because it is not Christian, and we need more Christian education. They are aligned with people who are libertarian, who just think any sort of government service is bad, and therefore public education is bad, who are aligned with business interests, who aren't really either, but who just want access to the money that would come from government to pay for public education. Because public education, if you think about it, is kind of the last big public service we have that has not been primarily privatized. When you think about public transportation or any of your government services, most of them are privatized except for public education. So all the people in the voucher coalition, for example, are not doing it from a religious perspective, but the people who are religious have aligned themselves with people who are not. Um, and I think like that they just want access to levers of power. So, the places like Hillsdale want to impose their views on other people. They want that power, and that's why they are doing what they're doing.
Another question, a Florida teacher, Melissa Calhoun, was fired for using a student's preferred name without parental consent. Is this being explored in other states as well? We've heard a lot of this in Iowa and pushing this agenda. And so what are you seeing across the country?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is increasingly common. I'm tracking the thread of bills that we're tracking right now are the ones that we work on primarily say some version of a public school can't force a teacher to use the correct pronoun or correct pronouns or preferred names for students if they have a religious objection. And often in those bills, we will see provisions that say that actually no teacher can use the student's preferred pronouns and correct names without parental consent. And then there are a lot of bills that are just on that parental consent front. So that is definitely something that we're seeing a lot. And yeah, it's in the same vein of, where there are a lot more bills that are introduced than are passing, but a concerning amount are passing. I work with a lot of LGBTQ organizations who fight these bills all the time. So this is becoming an increasingly common bill that we're seeing. I can't tell you how many states. I want to say in the ones that are specifically about the religious refusals to use the correct pronouns, it's probably between 5 and 10 states, I would say. But the just broad bans on using the correct pronouns without consent are definitely more states than that.
Next question. As we are looking at the replication of these bills across the country, one, is this happening through formal channels, organizations, and he references ALEC, or just copycat approaches? So is there a design, a strategy? And then two, can we expect other states to strip trans rights the way Iowa did?
Yeah, I'll start with two. Yes, definitely. Unfortunately, that again is something we're seeing. I don't know if it's quite the same bill that was in Iowa, but there are efforts in Ohio, I think Florida as well. There's a number of states where we're seeing these efforts to turn back the few protections that do exist to protect trans people and especially trans kids. And that's just going to get worse, right? To the point earlier about the cycle and where it is that is on the upswing right now. The formal channel question is a really good one, and I think an interesting one. So I talked earlier about the In God We Trust bills that I used to work on. When I actually first started at AU, I was told, "Oh, we don't work on these bills because they're really hard to fight, and we can't sue on them, right? They're really hard, so they don't happen that often, so we just kind of ignore them." Okay, great. And in my first legislative session, we saw a weird amount of them, like they were in 10, 11, 12 states. And we thought that was interesting. And then a reporter actually reached out to us and said, "Have you heard of this thing called Project Blitz?" He had found on the website of the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation a literal playbook called Project Blitz, where it broke out legislation into three groups. The first group was bills like posting the Ten Commandments in public schools. It has now been updated to include, I'm sorry, posting In God We Trust. It has now been updated to include the Ten Commandments bills. It was not in 2018. Bills to teach the Bible in public schools, and bills like that. And the literal strategy in this playbook was you introduce those because they're really not controversial, they're hard for people to oppose, and you get people on the record about whether or not they support religion. The second stage of bills were proclamations, things to say, "Oh, the US is a Christian nation," or "We have a Christian history. The founding fathers believed X." It was a slew of those, which for anyone who does legislation knows resolutions are really hard to fight because they don't have the force of law. They don't really do anything. So they're really difficult to mount an opposition to. They just are kind of statements of what people think. But, right, it's part of their literal strategy to continue to get people on the record and ratchet up engagement on this issue. And then the third group of bills were healthcare refusals, RFRAs, which are Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, which are unfortunately, I know this was the bill that brought Connie together, was the Iowa RFRA. right? So those are the bills that cause real tangible harm to people, right? Like the visible harm that you can see. And their idea was you got to build up slowly. And so there was a literal playbook that was there just out like accidentally out on the internet. We exposed it and they took it off. They kind of scrubbed their presence. So I say all that to say that like there are definitely groups out there that have things like this. We also know about the National Association of Christian Lawmakers. You've identified ALEC. So these groups exist and they talk, but the problem is they do it all behind the scenes, and the bits that we get are just kind of snippets, right? So we actually had someone, there was a reporter who reported on a National Association of Christian Lawmakers convening, where a bunch of state legislators got together, and there were people there from LifeWise, which is a group that does release time education that I talked about earlier. So they all meet together, but the only reason we got that was because someone kind of illegally recorded it and then shared it out. So we don't really have the ability to look at everything that they have and what they share, but we know that they do it through bits like that. Or I was watching a hearing one day, I think in Arkansas, and the legislator presenting the bill actually said, "Thanks to my friends at ALEC for doing this." If he hadn't said that, we would have had no idea that ALEC was there. We can kind of tell because when we see 35 Ten Commandment bills across the country and 15 of them have nearly identical language, we know that that's not that happening by coincidence, right? They're getting it from each other or someone is sharing it with them. But what we also know is that even with Project Blitz, right, there was someone who was asked, oh, he had passed a Project Blitz bill, I think it was an Inigawi Trust bill, and a reporter asked him about it, and the legislator had never heard of Project Blitz because what had actually happened was that he was said, a constituent came to me and gave me this idea, which happened, right, to the legislator, but the constituent was connected with Project Blitz. So he never has to mention it. He never has to say, oh, I'm part of the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation. They don't have to say they're part of ALEC. They don't have to say they're with the National Association of Christian Lawmakers. So it not only makes it out through these systems, but they just go out and tell someone, or a legislator reads about it in the news and says, oh, I'm here in Idaho and I saw this great bill out of Iowa. I want to copy it and make it myself. So it gets out there through both the formal channels that we aren't really able to peer into, but also kind of informal word of mouth channels.
So we got the chaplain bill in Iowa last year, and this year there was a legislator who went to a conference, and she fell in love with the chaplain bill. So it is still alive, and we're fighting it as best we can. So we're gonna go to vouchers, back to vouchers, and I'm gonna combine a couple of questions that are in the Q&A. One person asked about not understanding how vouchers could happen given separation of church and state in our country. And so tying that with also a different question of effective strategies of getting rid of vouchers in Iowa. I don't know that we can do that, but at least the other part of his question is accountability. There is absolutely no accountability in Iowa for vouchers, and they have fought that throughout the whole process. So church and state related to vouchers and accountability.
So the church state question is a fantastic one. So in the early 2000s, there was a lawsuit against an Ohio voucher program that challenged it under the First Amendment of the Constitution, saying it violated the separation of church and state. And in that case, the Supreme Court said that vouchers don't violate church-state separation because the program gave money to parents, and the parents made the choice of where to spend that money. So that's the joke I make as a lawyer is this is why people hate lawyers, right? So the reality is that fundamentally what this program did was pay for religious education at private schools, at religious private schools. No one can contravene that. But because parents decided to do that instead of the state, it was just the intermediary they needed to make it okay. So that is kind of the baseline that we're working with since the early 2000s. Despite that, a lot of states, actually it's 47 states, have a version of a no aid clause, which says some version of public money can't go to private or to religion. Some of them are broad and say all religions. Some are specific and say to private religious schools. Those provisions were actually where AU used to file a lot of lawsuits challenging voucher programs under those provisions. We successfully challenged them in Colorado. I know we challenged one in Florida, and then actually Florida kind of changed the rules. So we used to challenge them under that. The way Florida would change the rules was they would pass one of those tuition tax credit vouchers. And so again, they would say, oh, well, the state isn't giving money. They're just foregoing money that they could have gotten, and it's the donors are giving it to vouchers instead. But it's like, no, that's not right. It's the same thing. Again, this is why people hate lawyers, because if I'm going to pay my taxes and it would go to the general fund, but now I just donate and I pay the same amount, but now it's just not going to the government, like that's still government funding. In the end, the government is paying the cost of this voucher. So courts just essentially found ways around it. The real blow was the oh my God, 2020 or 2021 case, Espinoza v. Montana Department of Revenue, where the facts of this are a little bit convoluted, so I apologize in advance. But the Montana legislature had passed a voucher program. Someone sued saying it violated the state's no aid clause. The Supreme Court of Montana said, you are correct. It does violate the no aid clause. So we're going to strike down the whole program because we can't give vouchers just to secular schools, secular private schools, if we can't give them to secular religious or to private religious schools. So they struck down the whole program. Parents who really wanted that voucher then sued the US Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said it violated the US Constitution for the Montana Supreme Court to have struck down that program. So they resurrected the program that the court had struck down and said, if you are going, states don't have to fund private education, but if they do, they have to fund private religious schools as well. With that decision, it made it functionally impossible for us to sue under no aid clauses. There are still some states do have constitutional provisions that require states to fully fund public education. Those look like a lot of different ways. So those clauses still exist. Those are still avenues to challenge some of these programs. But the most successful system we used to the point of church-state separation were these no aid clauses. And the Supreme Court essentially gutted them and said that that's not a path anymore. They kind of updated that in Carson v. Macon, another case that I mentioned. And in that case, Maine, because Maine is so rural, they have a program where kids essentially live too far from a public high school, so they will pay their tuition to attend a private high school. And the program had conditions to say that the school had to be secular. Parents who wanted their kids to attend private religious schools sued. And the Supreme Court again said, if you can't exclude these schools for not being secular under this program. If you have this program, it has to be open to all schools. Because with the Supreme Court, basically, if you are not treating religion as good as or better than the secular counterpart, it's unconstitutional. That's kind of the fundamental baseline we're working with the Supreme Court. So that, unfortunately, is how we have vouchers despite church-state separation. To the broader question, I agree. Unfortunately, I think the reality is that, vouchers are the ability to repeal vouchers in any state, including Iowa, is a bit of a impossible goal. Accountability, right? They can make them better. The big thing that happened when Iowa did pass its vouchers was there was supposed to be, right? There was a debate about like, okay, these were going to be holdouts if there weren't these accountability measures. And then I don't even know what happened. And it was like a day and a half later and they both switched their vote and all the accountability measures got stripped out. I don't know that we will ever know what actually happened in that moment, but that is what happened in Iowa. So the way you can do it is just by continuing to demand it, right? To going to your legislators and saying, we want this. We want to know where the money is going. You have a taxpayer have a right to know where your money is going. Look at what public schools have to put out about how they spend their money. They have to have open meetings. They have school boards that are, they have budgets that are public, et cetera, all of these things. Think about other government programs that exist. You should be arguing for at least the same level of accountability as public schools because they are getting public money. So they should be held just as accountable as public schools. You have to make a racket about it. I don't know another way. It's not often a super successful strategy like that. They don't listen, but I don't think you just can't stop, right? When people give up, they know that they've won and they don't really care. I will say part of the problem here is that a big thing with the accountability is also accountability for the schools, and they intentionally don't put testing requirements in. They intentionally don't have any of that because they know that these schools are bad, and like they know when we test for student achievement, students don't do better. They do the same or worse. There's a lot of fraud and abuse in these programs, and that's why they don't do it because they know this is what exists. But there are examples from other states that you can use and say, look at what has happened in these other states. This is why we need accountability. If you want to know more about that, you can go to the National Coalition for Public Education. I can put the website in the chat, but there's a lot of resources there about accountability in voucher programs.
So the final question, I think, is in the Q&A, from the Q&A, and it's around back to what can we do? And can houses of worship that are mainline progressive do anything particularly in your mind to prevent, broadly speaking, the extremism that we're seeing and the extreme pieces of legislation? What's the power behind houses of worship in this game?
Yeah. So I said earlier the idea that when I started at AU, I thought it was Christianity versus, and was so heartened to learn that it's not that. And so a lot of what AU spends our time doing is working with groups like Interfaith Alliance because raising faith voices is so important. Because the other side is able to say, oh, you're under, it's anti-Christian bias. It's there's literally an anti-Christian bias task force coming out of the White House right now, right? Like that's an idea that they have, that it's just anti-Christian, it's just anti-faith, that everyone at AU is atheists, that we hate religion. And the more people of faith stand up and say, no, right? I am a person of faith and I agree with them. I am not anti-religious. I am pro-religion. I have my religious beliefs. I am Christian. I am Jewish. I am Muslim. I am whatever denomination I am. And I have that is really powerful to counter that narrative. Because that's what the news covers. That's what the legislators themselves believe. That's what the other side believes, that it is just, they think it is Christianity versus, and it's not. And the more we can say, we are Christians, we are non-Christians, people of faith, and we all agree agree with this. We agree with the principle of religious freedom for all, that religious freedom protects all of us to believe or not as we see fit, and not, it doesn't give us the right to harm others, that is really powerful and really important. But it's also, I think, heartening, again, to the idea that just talking to your friends and family about it, making sure that they understand that principle as well. Because I think that, the bit that they might get in their daily lives is really just what's happening in the news, the clips that they hear, and it will often be framed that way. So the more people of faith and, progressive churches, progressive congregations, et cetera, can stand up and say, no, no, I am a progressive, or I'm a person of faith and I don't agree with this, the better. I think you can't highlight those voices too much.
Fully agree. I always tell folks that if you are a person of faith, please say that when you're talking with a legislator, because they hear so much from the other side. And so they have to know that particularly Christianity is not monolithic in any of this. So
There in Texas in 2023, it happened actually again this year, but on the Ten Commandments bill when it was happening, one of the people who testified against it was the General Counsel for the Baptist General Convention of Texas. So a certified Christian. And one of the vice chairwoman of the committee in the Senate that he was testifying to was Southern Baptist, and her first question to him was, I don't understand how you can be a Baptist and not want to put up the Ten Commandments in public schools. And he said, that's why I oppose it. Because I am a Baptist, because I believe that I don't get to impose my religion on others, and because it's my job to teach my daughter about the Ten Commandments, not the public schools. Because I don't want to have to explain to my 5-year-old daughter in her kindergarten class why or what thou shalt not commit adultery means. That I get to decide when that happens and how it happens. And she was flabbergasted by the entire concept, but it was so powerful to show that like she did not get to dictate what being a Baptist meant, or what being a Christian meant in this case, and that there were other perspectives on it.
yeah. Fully agree. Nik, thank you so much. Thank you for spending time with us today. Thank you for all your work that you do across the country. I am always grateful for all of the information that you provide to me as an advocate, as a lobbyist, and just really appreciate having you here with us today. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to speak with you all.
Absolutely. For everybody who is on watching live, or if you're watching this after the event, we are glad that you're with us. We're glad that you took the time to watch and to learn. And just I would continue to ask you to continue to use your voice. Continue to use your voice in these times. I know it's difficult. I know it's exhausting, but we're so grateful that you are with us in all of this work. And for now, take care. Thank you, everyone.